At 11 p.m. on August 10, 2003, 19-year-old Sonya Ivanov and her best friend Timuri Tworak were walking down a street that was lined with a few shops, bars, and houses in Nome, Alaska. Both young women had long dark hair, and they were dressed almost the same in jeans, tennis shoes, and t-shirts. But Sonya was quite a bit taller. She was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and her height made her stand out no matter what she was wearing. Even though it was 11 o'clock at night, the sun was still out and shining overhead, because Nome, Alaska is less than 150 miles from the Arctic Circle, and that far north, at that time of the summer, the sun doesn't actually set until close to midnight. Sonya and Timuri were accustomed to the long summer days and the midnight sunsets because they'd spent their entire lives in Northwest Alaska. They were both Alaska Natives, which is a term used to define the multiple groups of Alaska's indigenous people. And they had both grown up over 100 miles south of Nome in a tiny village that was made up almost entirely of Alaska Natives. But not long after Sonya had graduated high school a year earlier, she had moved to Nome, and Timuri had followed her soon after that. And as Sonya and Timuri walked down the street that night, they still felt like they were living in a big city. In reality, Nome was just a small remote town that was home to only about 3,500 people, but it was still a lot bigger than where Sonya and Timuri had come from. And Nome's residents were a collection of Alaska Natives, as well as people who had grown up in town and others who had traveled there from far away to live in a place that a lot of people called America's Last Frontier. Sonya and Timuri walked past a bar, and they could hear music and laughter coming from inside. Then they turned off the main road and onto a side street and walked over to a friend's small wooden house. Sonya and Timuri stepped up onto the raised porch, and then Sonya knocked on the door. And then a moment later, their friend opened the door and stretched up on her toes to reach Sonya's shoulders and gave Sonya a big hug. Then Sonya and Timuri headed inside to the cramped living room, flopped down on the couch, and settled in for a night of board games with friends. And just a moment later, a young woman about Sonya's age walked into the living room from the kitchen and handed Sonya a can of beer. Sonya cracked open the beer, took a swig, and smiled. When Sonya had first moved to Nome from the village she grew up in, her parents had been worried that she was too young and naive to handle city life. Everybody in their small village knew Sonya, and all of the adults there looked out for all the kids. And Sonya had been a star basketball player at her high school, so she was even kind of famous in her own little town. And her parents really hoped she would stay at least a little longer in a place where she was loved, protected, and admired. But Sonya had told her parents that she felt like she had to go to Nome to get a job that would let her save up enough money to go to college. Because for most of her life, she dreamed of going off to college and experiencing new places and learning about new things. Sonya was outgoing, she was funny, and almost always in a very good mood. And so when she had arrived in Nome, she quickly landed work at a healthcare facility and she made a close group of friends. But she still felt connected to her roots because Timuri and her shared a small house, and Sonya's sister and brother-in-law lived close by. So pretty soon after Sonya had moved away and kind of found her place in Nome, her parents relaxed, and they were happy that their daughter seemed to be thriving in her new home. But what Sonya hadn't told her parents, or really anyone other than her best friend Timuri, was that she dreamed of a lot more than just going to college. She dreamed of making enough money to move away to Hawaii. Sonya loved her family, and she was proud of her Alaska Native heritage. In fact, when she had first moved to Nome, she had entered the Arctic Native Brotherhood pageant, which was an event where young people celebrated their native culture and spoke about important native issues of the time. But as much as Sonya loved the place and the culture she came from, she had gotten tired of the dark, cold winters in Northwest Alaska, those times when the sun was only up for a few hours and temperatures regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So now Sonya liked to imagine herself on a warm, sunny beach in Hawaii, listening to the waves crash onto the sand. She knew her family would be sad to see her leave, but she just felt like going somewhere far away was something she had to do while she was still young. In the living room, Sonya drank her beer, she laughed and played a board game with her friends, and they all talked about work and guys and girls they had crushes on like most groups of teenagers do. But then, at around midnight, the group fell silent for a second, because they heard a police siren wailing on a street nearby. Sonya and Timuri almost always felt safe in Nome, but there were times when they would hear police sirens that reminded them they were not in their little home village anymore. and Sonya's sister and her brother-in-law, who lived near Sonya, told her never to ignore her surroundings. Because in Nome, like across Alaska and the rest of the United States, Alaska Native women and Native American women were assaulted, abducted, and murdered at rates that were higher than the national average. And while the group of teenagers sat in Sonya's friend's living room that night, Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police was the one who was blaring the siren in his SUV while he was on his way to respond to a domestic violence call nearby. Officer Owens was originally from Florida, and he had noticed during his few years on the Nome police force that long summer nights often led people to drink, stay up late, and get into trouble a lot more than they ever did during the winter. But back at Sonya's friend's house, not long after the sound of the siren had faded, the group of teenagers put any thought of the police out of their minds, and Sonya and her friends got back to talking, laughing, and playing their board game. And then, at about 1 a.m. on August 11th, 2 hours after Sonya had arrived, she stood up from the couch and decided it was time for her to head home. Sonya said goodnight to the group, and Timmery said she was actually going to stay for a bit longer and that most likely she would just crash there for the night, so she would see Sonya at their place sometime the next day. Then Sonya and Timmery shared what they called their best friend goodbye ritual. They each tapped 2 of their fingers on the other's shoulder, then kissed their fingers, pointed them at the sky, and said, "Peace out, pal," to each other. Sonya opened the door and stepped outside. And as she started walking home, she thought to herself that she really needed to convince Tamari to come with her to Hawaii, because she couldn't imagine being there without her best friend who she had known for basically her whole life. Just after 1 a.m., so a few minutes after Sonya had left her friend's house, Sonya turned onto the main drag that cut through the center of town, and she walked along the side of the road. The sun had finally set, and it was about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A light rain had started to fall, and Nome looked like it was covered in mist. And as much as Sonya had gotten sick of the cold Alaska winters, she loved rainy Alaska summer nights like this one. So she decided to take her time walking home and to enjoy being outside in the rain. She walked past the bar, and she still heard music coming from inside. Then she walked a little bit further past an old house that overlooked the main street, and as she walked by, she heard someone call her name from the dark. Sonya was startled, and she felt her shoulders tense up. Then she turned and saw an older woman she knew sitting on the front porch smoking a cigarette. And Sonya laughed at herself for being scared. She exhaled and relaxed her shoulders. The woman smiled and asked Sonya how she was doing. Sonya said she was doing fine, and then she told the woman to have a good night and waved goodbye. Sonya kept walking down the street, and as she did, she felt the rain falling on her face. Then at some point, she heard people coming out of the bar that she had passed a little ways back, and she realized it must be getting late. But Sonya didn't have to work the next day, so she could just go home and sleep in as late as she wanted to, and the thought of that made her smile. Then, as Sonya approached a brightly lit gas station, she heard a car coming up behind her. So she stepped even more to the side of the road to make sure the car could pass her, but the car pulled up right next to her and stopped. The passenger side window rolled down, the driver leaned across the seat and called out to Sonya. And so Sonya, she stopped walking, and then she looked at the driver and actually approached the car. Sonya then leaned in through the open window and talked to the driver for a bit longer, and then Sonya climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. At around 5 p.m. on August 11th, so about 15 hours after Sonya had gotten into that car, Timmery came home from work. She was exhausted because she had stayed up late with her friends and then gone into work without sleeping much. She had come back to her and Sonya's house briefly that morning before heading to her job, and she hadn't seen Sonya, but she didn't think much of it. There was a chance Sonya had gotten up early and gone out for the day, or she might have run into friends on her way home and ended up staying somewhere else, which wasn't out of the ordinary for Sonya and Timmery, and neither of them had cell phones, so they didn't always keep in regular contact when they were apart. But hours after Timmery had gotten home from work, Sonya still had not come by the house or called, so Timmery decided to check in with Sonya's sister. Timmery called her on the landline and asked if she or her husband had seen or heard from Sonya in the last 24 hours. Sonya's sister said no, but she didn't sound worried at all. Sonya was 19 years old, and her sister knew she liked to go out and have a good time with friends, and she also knew there was a guy or two Sonya had been seeing. So she told Timmery that Sonya was probably just out and would most likely be home sometime soon. And so that night, Timmery went to bed kind of early because she was still worn out from her day, and she figured she'd either hear Sonya come home later that night or she would see her in the morning. But by the following afternoon, Timmery still had not seen or heard anything from Sonya, and now Timmery was starting to get worried. She called Sonya's sister again, but again, the sister said she had not heard from Sonya, and so Timmery decided that she had to tell the police. But Timmery had grown up in a small village that did not have a traditional police department, so she didn't even really know how to go about telling the police what was happening. And so she decided it would be best for her to just go to the police station and talk to someone in person. Timmery threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, she slipped on her tennis shoes, and she headed towards the police station in the center of town. The rain had stopped, but it was still cool and gray outside. It only took a few minutes for Timmery to get to the police station. She walked inside the small building that was lit up with bright fluorescent lights, and she was greeted by Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native who had responded to the domestic violence call when Timmery and Sonya had been at their friend's house. Officer Owens asked Timmery what she needed, and Timmery would tell him that, Sonya, her friend, had gone missing and she hadn't heard or seen from her since she had left to walk home over 24 hours earlier. Officer Owens was just about 29 years old, and he had brown hair, a goatee, and a warm smile. He tried to put Timmery at ease because it was obvious she was very upset, and he told her that the police had not gotten any reports about anything out of the ordinary over the last day. Then another officer who was sitting nearby overheard the conversation, and he walked over to them. He said the best explanation was probably that her friend had gone out partying, and she was either still partying or recovering somewhere with friends. But Timmery said that Sonya had only had one beer on the night they were last hanging out, so it wasn't like she was just wandering around town drunk. But the officer said there still probably wasn't anything to worry about. Then one of the officers took down Sonya's name and Timmery's personal information, and then told Timmery they would call her if they heard anything. Timmery thanked the officers, she turned around and walked out of the station. But as she headed home, she felt like she'd been totally blown off. And she didn't like to buy into stereotypes, but she knew a lot of her friends and family believed that the cops in town would do as little as possible when it came to helping Alaska Native women, and she really hoped that was not the case. Not long after Timmery had left the police station, the phone in the police station rang, and Officer Matt Owens answered it. Sonya's boss was on the other line, and he was calling to say that Sonya had not come into work that day, and he was worried because Sonya never missed work or was even late without calling first. Owens hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Then he got up and walked the short distance across the station to the chief of police's office. The chief waved Owens in and asked him what was going on. And Owens told him about Timmery's visit, about her friend Sonya, and now Sonya's boss had just called. And so Owens said they might have a legitimate missing persons case on their hands. At 8:30 p.m. on August 13th, the day after Timmery had gone to the police station, a volunteer firefighter was driving on an old dirt road about 5 miles outside of Nome. After the chief of police had talked to Officer Owens about Sonya, he contacted the fire department and a couple of community groups to help organize a search for Sonya. And the volunteer firefighter had gotten the call, went right out to his car, and started driving in and around the city to help the search however he could. He was driving slowly, looking out the windshield and both windows, trying not to miss anything that might lead him to Sonya. The road he was on had once been very busy when Nome had experienced a gold rush all the way back in the 1890s, but now the roads around the old gold mines were pretty much abandoned and almost nobody ever drove on them. But most people in town knew that young couples still would sometimes find their way out to the abandoned roads to spend some time together alone, and that the area near the mines had become a kind of lover's lane. And the volunteer firefighter thought, maybe Sonya and a guy she was seeing had come out that way, and maybe they'd gotten stuck in the mud after the rainstorm or something like that. The volunteer firefighter continued to scan both sides of the narrow road, but all he could see was bushes and thick underbrush stretching out in both directions. But then suddenly something caught his eye and he slammed on the brakes. He looked out the driver's side window and stared into a bush. He thought something was out there, but he couldn't tell what it was. So he turned off the engine, he got out of his car and walked over to those bushes. Then he crouched down and peered inside the bushes, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His stomach turned and he felt like he might get sick, but he made himself turn around and run back to his car. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, turned it around, and sped down the old narrow mining road and back into town as fast as he could. Less than 30 minutes later, the same volunteer firefighter was heading back to the bushes on the side of the old mining road, this time in the passenger seat of a Nome police SUV that was being driven by Officer Brian Wayavana. Officer Wayavana headed down the road and stopped when the volunteer fireman told him to. Then Wayavana stepped out of the SUV and walked over to the bushes by himself. Wayavana was in his mid-30s with dark black hair and a black mustache, and he smoked cigarettes regularly while on the job. He would often say that being a cop in Nome was 39.5 hours a week of sheer boredom and a half hour of oh shit. And this definitely felt like an oh shit moment to him. Wayavana crouched down, and when he looked into the bushes, he hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the sun was still bright enough for him to see clearly, and he knew he was staring at the body of Sonya Ivanov. Wayavana stood up, but then he quickly bent over again and put his hands on his knees and breathed in several times through his nose. Wayavana knew Sonya's sister and brother-in-law quite well, and he couldn't imagine having to tell them what he had just discovered. But before Wayavana could worry about that, he had to act fast. He knew that the small Nome Police Department was not equipped to handle the forensics investigation required in a case like this. They would need help from the crime lab and the Alaska State Troopers. But both of those groups worked out of Anchorage, which was over 500 miles away, and there was no road that directly connected Anchorage to Nome, so it could take them a while to get there. Wayavana went back to his SUV, he opened the door and grabbed the radio. He called in to the officers on duty and told them he needed everyone to help him come lock down a crime scene and to make sure that nothing happened to it until help from Anchorage arrived. On August 14th, so a day after Sonya's body had been discovered, criminalist Carrie Cathcart from the Alaska State Crime Lab in Anchorage sat in the passenger seat of Officer Wayavana's SUV as they wound their way down the dirt mining road just outside of Nome. When Nome police had called the crime lab, the case was handed over to Cathcart. She booked a flight and had arrived in Nome earlier that morning. And while Nome police had waited for Cathcart to get there, they covered Sonya's body and most of the surrounding area with tarps to keep the crime scene as untouched as they possibly could. And Nome police officers had taken shifts guarding the crime scene to make sure nobody came near it. Wayavana eased off the gas and stopped the car several yards away from the crime scene. Cathcart looked out and she saw the tarps covering the area. She was used to visiting scenes days after a crime had taken place because traveling in Alaska often just took a lot longer than it would in other parts of the United States. Cathcart got out of the SUV, slipped on a pair of gloves, and followed Wayavana to the bushes on the side of the road. Cathcart wore hiking boots, a windbreaker over a dark shirt, and she had long blonde hair. Wayavana called another officer over, and together they removed a tarp from the bushes. Then they walked away from Cathcart and removed the remaining tarps that covered other parts of the crime scene. Cathcart stared down at Sonya's lifeless body inside of the bushes. Cathcart had worked homicide cases and other violent crimes for a few years, but it still hit her very hard when she saw victims as young as Sonya. As Cathcart approached the body, the most obvious thing that stood out about Sonya's body was that she was naked, except for a sock on one of her feet. But there were no clothes or scraps of torn fabric anywhere in the area. Then Cathcart moved in closer to get a better look. They would have to do a full autopsy and examination, but it was pretty clear to her right away that Sonya had died from a gunshot at close range. Cathcart asked an officer if Nome police had found bullet casings in the area, but the officer said they hadn't really found anything before they locked the site down and contacted Anchorage for help. Cathcart made her way back to the road and started scanning the dirt. She saw sets of tire tracks that looked like they matched a police SUV, like the one Wayavana was driving, but then she stopped cold and shouted for Wayavana to come look at something. Wayavana walked over to Cathcart on the road, and she pointed to a set of tire tracks in the dirt. He didn't really know why she was showing them to him, but then she motioned for him to come look closer, and she said the tracks were most likely from a truck, but importantly, it looked like the track had mismatched tires. This, of course, would make it much easier for the police to find this truck, especially because they were already starting with a small number of people who lived in Nome to begin with. So Wayavana made a note about the mismatched tires in his notebook. Then Cathcart followed those tire tracks back down the road towards the spot where Sonya's body was. Wayavana walked right behind her. Cathcart stepped over to the bushes right on the side of the road. She squinted her eyes and looked as closely as she could at every branch, and a slight smile began to come across her face. She turned to Wayavana and motioned for him to look at what she had just seen. And on one of the branches, she pointed to a streak of blue paint that she was almost certain had come from an automobile. So now Wayavana believed if he could just track down a blue truck with mismatched tires, he would have a good chance of finding Sonya's killer. In the days following Carrie Cathcart's examination of the crime scene, Nome police fanned out across the city. They spoke to Sonya's friends, her sister and brother-in-law, and anybody willing to come forward to say they had seen Sonya around the time she had disappeared. Officer Wayavana had met with Timmery the night Sonya's body had been discovered, but now he wanted to meet with her again to see if she might have any information that could lead him to the owner of a blue truck with these mismatched tires. So, on a warm August morning, Wayavana knocked on the door of Timmery and Sonya's house. Timmery opened the door, and Wayavana could see that her face was puffy and her eyes were bloodshot. It was clear she had been crying. Timmery led Wayavana into the small front room of the house. The place was messy, like a teenager's bedroom might be. There were clothes hanging on chairs and empty soda cans all over the coffee table. Timmery sat down on the couch, and Wayavana cleared off a chair and sat down across from her. Timmery was glad that it was Wayavana who had come to the house to talk to her. Timmery knew that Wayavana knew Sonya's sister, so Timmery believed Wayavana would do everything he could to find out who had killed Sonya. Wayavana started by just asking Timmery if she was okay, but she just shook her head and tried to fight off tears. Then he asked her if Sonya had any enemies or somebody who might have been angry with her. But Timmery said Sonya was one of the happiest, easygoing people she'd ever known, and everybody who had met her liked her right away. But then Timmery trailed off in the middle of a sentence, and she looked surprised, like she'd just thought of something that she believed she should have thought of a lot earlier. Wayavana asked her what was going on, and Timmery leaned forward on the couch, and she said there was a guy who Sonya had kind of hung out with a couple of times, and she knew they had kissed a couple of times, but it really wasn't anything serious. But Timmery said the guy was really into Sonya, but Sonya was not really into him. So Wayavana asked who this guy was, and Timmery would say it was a friend of theirs named Kunuk Angsuk. Then Timmery said that Kunuk was usually the nicest guy in the world, like a big teddy bear, but he did have a temper, and he could fly off the handle when he got mad. Officer Wayavana thanked her for the information. Then he asked Timmery if she happened to know what kind of car Kunuk drove, and she said he drove a blue truck. Wayavana's eyes lit up. He couldn't believe he'd possibly found the person he was looking for so quickly. He thanked Timmery again, and then he headed out of her house, got into his SUV, and drove down the street to the police station. And when he filled in the chief of police about what he had just learned, the chief set things in motion for them to impound and search Kunuk's blue truck. It took a few days to get everything in order, but then Wayavana, Officer Matt Owens, other members of the Nome police, and the criminalist Carrie Cathcart searched the truck, and they were stunned by what they found. Kunuk's truck was indeed blue, and it had mismatched tires that fit with the tracks that Cathcart had found on the mining road near Sonya's body. But that wasn't all. One of the truck's tires had blood spatter on it, and inside the truck, they found multiple rifles and a tarp that was covered in blood. And so after this discovery, police felt like they had found their killer. In late August, so a couple of weeks after Sonya had been found, Nome police had more than enough evidence to make Sonya's friend, Kunuk, their prime suspect. So Wayavana and another officer drove out to Kunuk's house. When police had taken his truck, Kunuk knew they would be back soon to talk to him, so he did his best to stay calm as he let the investigators back into his house. Kunuk had short brown hair, and he wore jeans and a yellow t-shirt, and he had a silver earring in his left ear. Kunuk sat down in a chair in the front room of his house, and the officers stayed standing. Wayavana didn't waste any time. He asked Kunuk when was the last time he'd seen Sonya, and Kunuk thought about it for a second and then said the last time he saw her was maybe 2 weeks before she died. And Kunuk would say that he and Sonya didn't really even talk when he last saw her, that really they had just kind of crossed paths in town. After this answer, the other officer who was there with Wayavana asked why Kunuk had a bloody tarp in his truck and why was there blood spatter on one of his tires. Kunuk started tapping his foot on the floor, and he looked away from the cops, and without making eye contact, he told them that he'd been out hunting 70 miles away at the time of Sonya's death, and that's why the rifles and the bloody tarp were in his truck, and the blood on the tarp was just animal blood. But the officer pressed Kunuk again about the blood spatter on his tire. And this time, Kunuk did look back at the officer, and he would say that he'd run over a rabbit or some other kind of small animal when he was driving out to go hunting, and so the blood on the tire must have just been from that. The officers were totally skeptical of this answer, but they stayed neutral and continued to question Kunuk a bit longer, and then when they were finally done, the officers were convinced that this was their guy. The evidence against Kunuk was solid, and the running over the rabbit story just seemed like a convenient excuse he'd made up on the spot. So Weyavana asked Kunuk to submit to a DNA test, and he told Kunuk if he was innocent like he said he was, a DNA test was the best way to prove that. Kunuk continued to tap his foot on the floor, but then he looked at Weyavana and he nodded and said he would submit samples for the test. Weyavana knew he would have to wait for the results from this DNA test and for the results from the test that the crime lab was going to run on the blood found on Kunuk's truck and on the tarp. But Weyavana hoped that soon he would be able to tell Sonya's sister and the rest of Sonya's family and her friends that they had found Sonya's killer. In late August, so almost 3 weeks after Sonya's murder, her body was returned to the small village where she had grown up. And her family and friends there had a funeral service and an outdoor vigil to celebrate Sonya's life and to mourn the life she never got to live. At the vigil, people who knew and loved her most talked about how happy and kind Sonya had been and how much her community and her culture had meant to her. And they said they wanted police to bring this case to a close quickly and to make sure the person who had killed Sonya was brought to justice. But they knew that even if that happened, the village would never fully heal from what had been done to Sonya. At around 2 a.m. on a day in early September, about a week after the vigil, Officer Weyavana sat in his SUV in a parking lot off the main street in Nome. He cracked his window, took a long drag off a cigarette, and exhaled the smoke out into the early morning air. Just like Sonya's friends and family, Weyavana hoped the case would be solved soon, and he had really believed that Sonya's friend Kunuk was the killer. But in the weeks following Kunuk's interview, parts of the investigation had kind of come to a halt. Test results from the tarp found in Kunuk's truck revealed that the blood on the tarp was animal blood, just like Kunuk had said, and several of Kunuk's friends said they had been with him when he was hunting on the day of Sonya's murder. Weyavana still was not ready to move on from Kunuk as a suspect. But while he waited for results from Kunuk's DNA test to come back, the case suddenly didn't seem as open and shut as it had just a couple of weeks earlier. And now, the investigation team on this case had been reduced to just Weyavana and one other Nome officer. And Weyavana was stuck working nights while the other investigator worked days. So Weyavana sat in an empty parking lot near an empty street in the dead quiet of the morning, and he felt like he wasn't doing anything to help. Then he leaned over and grabbed a file folder from the passenger seat. Inside the folder were all of the notes that he and other officers had compiled during interviews they'd conducted following Sonya's murder. He flipped through the notes and tried to look at everything with fresh eyes, just in case he'd missed something. And as he read over a page right in the middle of the files, he almost gasped out loud. Weyavana was reading comments made by a woman who claimed she had seen Sonya get into a vehicle near a gas station at the same time that Sonya was believed to have disappeared. But for some reason, this woman's statement had never been followed up on. And so later that day, Weyavana, who was bleary-eyed and fighting off sleep, headed to that woman's house to talk to her. The woman said early on the morning of the murder, she had been smoking on her porch when Sonya had walked by and she had called out to her. The two of them had talked a bit, and then she watched as Sonya walked further down the street, got into a vehicle, and drove off. Then the woman gave a detailed description of the vehicle Sonya had climbed into, and it was not a blue truck. Weyavana thanked the woman and then rushed back to the police station where he told the chief of police all this new information he'd discovered. And the chief immediately put more officers back on the case, and they all went on a search to find this new vehicle that this woman had described. Just before 3 a.m. on September 23rd, so a few weeks after Weyavana had spoken to that woman, Officer Matt Owens, the Florida native, stood near a gravel pit down the road from where Sonya had been found. And in this gravel pit, Officer Owens saw a vehicle that matched the description of the one that woman had seen Sonya get into. Owens quickly called into the station and let them know what he'd found, and immediately other officers rushed out to the scene. But just minutes later, Officer Owens was on his cell phone to the police station again, but this time he was out of breath and he was running for his life. He kept shouting that gunshots had rung out right after he'd approached this vehicle in the gravel pit, and so now he was taking cover, but he needed backup fast. Not long after that, Wayavana and other members of the force arrived at the gravel pit, and they saw that Owens was crouched down behind some bushes nearby. They leapt out of their cars and they fanned out all across the area looking for whoever had been shooting at Officer Owens, but they never found anyone. And so after the police had secured the area and made sure it was safe, they all reconvened with Officer Owens over at the gravel pit, and sure enough, inside of it was this car that Owens had found and called in. And they noticed the driver's side window was completely shattered, very likely from one of the rounds that had just been fired at Officer Owens. That day, the police would conduct a full search of this vehicle, and that search would lead them right to Sonya's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence discovered from the vehicle that Officer Owens found in the gravel pit, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of August 12, 2003, the day Sonya Ivanov was murdered. Just after 1 a.m., the killer drove slowly down the street in the center of Nome. Light rain fell on the windshield, and the mist gave the whole town kind of an eerie glow. The killer heard music coming from the bar, and they watched as a few drunk people stumbled outside. The killer laughed and just kept cruising down the street. And in the bright lights from the gas station up ahead, the killer saw Sonya walking on the side of the road. It was hard to miss the very beautiful 5-foot 11-inch tall teenager. The killer grinned and they felt their hearts start to race a bit. Then they drove right past Sonya and hit the brakes. Then the killer rolled down the passenger window just as Sonya walked by, and they called out to her. Sonya stopped, walked over, and leaned in through the open window. The killer smiled and asked if Sonya wanted a ride home. Sonya liked walking in the rain, but there was a chance the storm could pick up quickly and get a lot worse, and it was getting late, so she said sure, she'd love a ride. The killer told her to hop inside, and so she did. She opened the door, got into the passenger seat, and then once Sonya was inside, the killer rolled up her window, they locked the doors, and drove down the road. But when they got to the point in the road where the killer should have turned to go to Sonya's house, they just kept on driving. Sonya said, "Hey, you missed the turn," but the killer just looked at her and smiled and then hit the gas. Sonya started to get scared and she asked the killer what they were doing, but the killer just told her to be quiet. When they reached the outskirts of town, the killer turned off the main road onto an old dirt road. Sonya desperately wanted to get out, but they were going so fast and she was just too scared to do anything. Finally, the killer slowed down and pulled into some bushes on the side of the dirt road and parked. Then the killer got out. Sonya tried to open her door, but she couldn't unlock it, and then she looked up out her window and she saw the killer standing there in the moonlight. Sonya screamed, and at the same time, the killer opened the door, they dragged her outside, and then wrapped their arms around her from behind. Sonya was tall and strong and fast, and so right away she began using all her strength to try to get out from the killer's grasp, and at some point she began leaning forward and bucking her legs out behind her, and she was able to get out of the killer's grip. But before Sonya could actually run away to freedom, the killer drew a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband and fired. And that bullet struck Sonya square in the back of the head. She fell to the ground, dead. Without wasting any time, the killer ran over and stripped off all of Sonya's clothes, except for one sock that they just overlooked. Then the killer dragged Sonya's body into a nearby bush. The killer went back to the road, grabbed Sonya's clothes and tossed them into the trunk. Then the killer closed the trunk, took a deep breath, calmed themselves down, and got back into the driver's seat. Then they drove away from the murder scene inside of their Nome Police Department SUV. Officer Matt Owens of the Nome Police Department killed Sonya. It turned out that woman who was smoking on her porch and then called out to Sonya on the night she disappeared, well, she saw Sonya get into a vehicle, and that vehicle was a police SUV. but the woman said she had not seen which one of the officers was driving the SUV at the time. The mismatched tire tracks that had been found at the murder scene turned out to be from a truck that a young man and woman had been driving, and the couple had just gone out to Lover's Lane on this mining road around the same time that Sonya was murdered. They had nothing to do with her murder. But the blue paint that criminalist Carrie Cathcart had found on the bushes ended up matching blue paint from the Nome Police Department insignia that was on all of their squad vehicles. And when Officer Owens had heard about this paint being found, and about the woman who said she saw Sonya drive off with a cop, he went out and drove the police SUV that he'd been driving the night he killed Sonya out to the gravel pit and dumped it there. Then later, he went back and reported finding the dumped SUV in hopes that this would eliminate any suspicion towards him. And Officer Owens would say that he thought someone from town must have stolen the police SUV and then driven it out to the mining road where they killed Sonya. And Owens was the one who shattered the SUV's window and then called the station to say he was being shot at, to make it seem like whoever had really killed Sonya was now monitoring this vehicle and gonna kill anybody who went near it. But other Nome police officers and the Alaska State Troopers saw right through Owens' lies. After finding him at the gravel pit, crouched down behind some bushes as if he was being shot at, the general consensus was, this looks staged. And so when they got out and they talked to Owens and he described who was shooting at him and from where, it just didn't really add up. And they searched the area and of course didn't find any shooter. And also just generally, the other officers just didn't buy the idea that someone from town would have the audacity to steal a police SUV and then go commit a murder with the SUV in tow. It just didn't make sense. Also, criminalist Carrie Cathcart very early on had said that she believed whoever had killed Sonya had a deep understanding of how to sanitize a crime scene because there was no evidence left behind and her clothes had been removed. And so Cathcart actually said, the killer could be a cop. And so ultimately, Officer Owens was arrested for Sonya's murder. It would turn out that in the years Owens had lived in Nome, 6 local women had claimed he sexually assaulted them. And 2 of those women said they had filed formal reports with the Nome police, but nothing had ever been done about it. In Sonya's case, there was no evidence of assault or rape, but some officers believed Owens intended to sexually assault Sonya when he picked her up, but when she fought back, he killed her. Officer Matt Owens was convicted of murder and evidence tampering and sentenced to 101 years in prison with a chance for parole after 34 years. Sonya's murder shed further light on what many Alaska Native communities believed was a history of police neglect, harassment, and violence towards Alaska's indigenous population. And so, in 2007, the Sonya Ivanov Act was signed into law in Alaska. That law states that any peace officer, firefighter, or correctional employee convicted of first-degree murder will receive a mandatory sentence of 99 years in prison.
He was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out, and in fact he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelley says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn, you're gonna put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelley just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelley and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelley and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelley thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line?" And Sean's like, "I don't know, maybe." Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property, and so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property, you need to leave." As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, "This is private property," so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest, lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by, and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters, and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound. And there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, "We gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go." And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelly, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by, and Eric and Shelly are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he just says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are three creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. Two others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. It could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door, and they lock it. And without saying a word, the two of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin, and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut. And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you gotta look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. But they're kind of poking their head out the window and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in the window, and the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her, and Shelly gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly's on the ground looking at Chelsea, and she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs. And she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her 2 dogs and they don't come out. Goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast, and he'd have to unlock the barn, and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while, he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck, and back the truck up to the front door, and then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car, and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside, and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look, and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. You can see all 5. They're facing the house still, but he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field, and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelley, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there, when the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does, he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelley, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on, and she yells, Eric, what's going on? And he goes, stay up there, stay up there. Shelley, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen, waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelley lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, all right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear? And finally, she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately, that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless. And Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon. He can't get to his vehicle. They're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. As they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs. And they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel. And they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a 2nd floor roof, and then the 1st floor was a little bit wider than the 2nd floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that 1st roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor windows. And so they're laying there, and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows, and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window, and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature, and the creature couldn't see them. All night they're listening to these creatures running around, and sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass. They never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs, and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house, in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that, and they have not experienced anything like that since they left.